And the day came when man conceived of a materialistic, deterministic, reductionistic, objectively real clockwork universe made of space, time, energy and matter, governed by fixed and changing physical constants and laws. Microscopic particles that become atoms, that become molecules, that become macroscopic, perceivable, concrete, tangible stuff. Randomness and disorder that transforms into order, that transforms into patterns, that transform into self-organization. Simple chunks of inanimate matter that evolve into complex, organized chunks of animate matter that somehow evolve into self-aware, conscious chunks of matter that are able to think, feel, experience, share, create, communicate. Here we have an immense, expanding material universe that came out of a spaceless, timeless, infinitely dense point of energy that came out of nothingness. An incredibly simple universe evolving into an incredibly complex universe that does so by just following a few deterministic, immutable physical laws. A Goldilocks universe that is able to convert disorganized bits of dead matter into self-organized bits of living matter simply because the conditions happen to be just right. A universe that sprouts life and consciousness, intelligence and technology without any reason, purpose or goal. A universe that comes into existence, changes, evolves and ends up observing itself just because it was meant to do so. But the important question is, who are you in this universe? You are basically a rather insignificant collection of interacting particles in a vast, gigantic, purposeless, meaningless universe. A collection of particles that somehow inexplicably became self-aware. A collection of particles that became conscious, started to perceive, started to think, started to feel. These particles don't just exist, but strangely, they have acquired the ability to have an inner experience. As a collective, they appear to know, to feel, to experience what it is like to be you. However, in this universe, this differentiated you can only be the result of accidents coexisting within a landscape ultimately ruled by predetermined physical laws. In this clockwork universe, cause and effect rule the world. Causality is always linear and physical, self-contained within this space-time-matter universe. Everything that exists must have a physical cause. It must be the result of a mechanistic physical process. The whole of your existence, hence, can be reduced to the interactions of tiny bits of physical matter governed by physical laws occurring inside this causally closed universe. Your entire life, your emotions, hopes, fears, ambitions, expectations, decisions, your imagination, intuition, creativity. All of these can ultimately be explained via lengthy, linear, bottom-up causal chains that are the result of material particles following specific physical laws. And these causal chains can ultimately be traced back to the very beginning of space-time, the moment of the Big Bang. Think about it for a moment. Your self-awareness, your intelligence, your thoughts, your choices and decisions, your entire conscious experience can only be produced by some piece of machinery following deterministic physical laws. Your consciousness must be just a complicated byproduct of material particles and their physical interactions. In fact, at the most basic level, your mind must be reducible to all these particle interactions occurring within your brain. Hence, what you call mind can be nothing but your brain, clearly defined, firmly located, permanently imprisoned within a limited region of space-time.
Now that model of physics was disproven in the early 20th century. We know physics doesn't work, the world doesn't work as a machine. It's a quantum world. We don't live in a clockwork universe.
Hi, my name is Jerry Croft, and I'm a associate professor emeritus, psych professor in California. Just published this book, Psyche's Exile, An Empirical Odyssey in Search of the Soul. So as an introduction to what has come before and what's coming after, the word psyche in Greek means soul. Okay, so Psychology literally means the study of the soul. And one thing that American academic psychology does not study is the soul. Everything else but. We go all the way back 120 years to Charles Sanders Peirce and the father of psychology, of American psychology, William James, who was related to Henry James, the novelist. They're in Harvard, or James is in Harvard, and they're trying to take the Department of Psychology out of the Department of Religion or philosophy and put it into the Department of Social Sciences. They want psychology to be a science, to operationally define their terms, to use logical positivism, empiricism, pragmatism, control groups, statistical analysis. And the beginning of science of psychology begins then. This is at the time of the Newtonian clockwork universe, okay? Determinism, materialism. If you cannot define that concept so that it can be measured quantitatively, it doesn't belong in psychology. That's the attitude that is incubating at the turn of the century, and it reaches its apex with the father of American behaviorism, John Watson, who he wrote a book called Radical Behaviorism. And here is his statement about the soul. No one has ever touched a soul or seen one in a test tube or has in any way come into relationship with it as he has with other objects of his daily experience. And thus begins, really, the paradigm of psychology that the soul equals the mind, and that can be reduced to the mind. The mind can be reduced to the brain, and the brain can be reduced to those neurological connections. This is the clockwork universe of modern psychology, and it is not going all the way back to 1917. It exists very much to this very day. Here's an interview of Bill Moyers talking about the politically correct orthodoxy of mechanism, materialism, and reductionism.
Are we just the activity of molecules? Are we just molecules in motion? Is this inquiry leading us to think of ourselves as just primarily, or essentially, or just material?
Yes. When I say that the mind is the brain, when I say that vision just is a function of the brain, that's what I mean. That there is nothing other than the cells and the way they're put together.
So, this leads to a number of taboo subjects in psychology. If it doesn't fit this paradigm, which has existed at least since the time of John Watson, it doesn't exist, or we don't want to hear about it, or this is junk science, or it's not science. If it's not Newtonian, it's not science, at least in psychology. So let's take a look at our first taboo, near-death experiences. Okay? There are many people who have passed away, and then they get resuscitated. And when they do, almost 50% report a certain kind of experience in that original short flatlining period when they're apparently gone, dead. But then they're resuscitated and come back to life. They report that they're going down a tunnel, that their psyche has left their body, that it is usually somewhere in the room looking down on them, watching everything. One lady said, my doctor was left-handed and he had a bald spot on the top of his head because I was up there watching everything, watching them working on my body. And then they report that this is a very ecstatic experience, and they also report that there's a choice point that they reach to continue to go on or to stay back. Here is an interview with a person who had a near-death experience, and then I'll tell you why this is so taboo.
She hit us at about 80 miles an hour when we were going to severe closed head injury. Bicep was cut in half, and I was in a coma. 7 days, they induced another coma because I was going crazy, and it was supposed to only be in the coma for maybe 24 to 48 hours, and I didn't wake up. I flatlined, and I ended up being in the coma for a total of about 14 days. When I was flatlined, I remember being surrounded by a white, fuzzy light, and I was being held. Someone was hugging me. I couldn't see that person, but I knew I was with God or my higher power. I felt very pleasant. I wasn't afraid. It was very comforting. Actually, it was probably the best feeling that I've ever felt in my life, in my death. I felt my best feeling. And I was just kind of so content there that I wanted to just go to that place. I wanted to be with that feeling. And just as I was about to go, you hear all the time people say, your life flashes before your eyes. Well, my life flashed before my eyes. It wasn't really what I expected. I didn't see actual people or physical things. It was more of the essence of everything, but it was very clear. I saw me with my grandchildren. I don't even have children yet. I saw me when I was younger doing things that I loved to do and playing and dancing and people I loved, and it was all about the love. It was all about the love. And I knew that if I went to that place, I would be okay, but I would never have this life again. And I loved this life, and I loved to live, so I started fighting and crying and praying, please God, don't make me die, I don't want to die, I don't want to die. And I fought and fought. And then I felt all at once like I was being sucked through outer space. It was just like, so then I ended up in the corner of my hospital room, looking at my body and seeing all my family sitting around, upset. And I tried to tell them, for some reason I had special powers that I could move around in this form. So I would go over to my family and my boyfriend at the time, who was 16, and I would say, I'm okay, you know, and I'd try to comfort them, but they couldn't hear me, and I was so annoyed by that. And then I would get bored, and I would go in my body for a little while, and it would get too much, it would be too much pain, and so I would come back out. I got pretty comfortable being in that form. I would say, now that I think back on it, I was probably in and out of my body for about a week and a half. I would go to different rooms. My parents didn't believe anything that I was saying until I woke up one night and I went into my mom's room and I said, Mom, when I was in a coma upstairs, were you and Dad and Grandma down in the cafeteria, and Dad said this, and you said this, and Grandma stood up, and this happened? And my mom just looked at me in awe and was like, how do you know that? And I said, I was there. And she couldn't believe. I knew word for word exactly what happened. And I was like, I just remembered I was there, because things came back to me over time. And I mean, it's been 13 years, so I'm getting pretty comfortable with it at this point, but it took a while for me to really understand.
As much as I want to show you of that, but here's a little statistic. 344 cardiac patients who were resuscitated, 62 reported almost near identical near-death experiences. In 1992, a Gallup poll reported 13 million people said they came close to death and had the sensation of leaving their bodies. It's an interesting database, isn't it? Now, the point of view of academic psychology is this. If you are an assistant professor and you want to study near-death experiences, go right ahead. A study on people who have near-death experiences are more neurotic, great, or are more mentally ill, great, or used to be come from dysfunctional families, great, as long as you're not taking it seriously. But if you're an assistant professor who says, boy, I find this really fascinating, 13 million people, I would like to discuss and to study the possibility that people leave their bodies, that the psyche is transcendental. Wow. You want to do that? You want to publish in that area? Number one, you're not going to get published in that area. Number two, we don't want you in our department. Number three, you're not going to get tenure. okay? Because the psyche, the soul, is the brain, and the brain does not leave the skull. So it's impossible. Whatever Michaela experienced had to be hallucinatory. It had to be a drug-induced hallucination. Unfortunately, Michaela, you experienced a transitory mental illness. But thanks very much for sharing. That's the point of view. That's our first taboo. So now we're going to look at our second taboo, telepathy. Way back in 50 years ago, Dr. Rhine from Duke University decided that parapsychology, telepathy, clairvoyance, and those subject matters, which are, were always under some kind of a circus tent, should be taken more seriously. He started the Journal of Parapsychology. It was never recognized by the American Psychological Association, but he did attempt to use rigorous scientific methods, statistical procedures, set up experimental paradigms, and try to determine whether or not there's anything to this subject. The journal is still in existence, and it represents a very interesting research history. So let's just get a feeling here for what we're talking about when we talk about telepathy. This is very anecdotal.
Twins have so many stories of telepathy and feeling each other's pain and happiness. We have had
experiences.
Lisa was living in Australia.
I was living in Australia, halfway around the world.
And I was living in New York City.
And Debbie was living in New York. And I actually got in a serious car accident in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the outback.
On a dark, deserted road, Lisa's car hit a cow and spun out of control. Debbie, some 10,000 miles away, says she knew instantly her sister was in trouble.
I looked at my mother and I said, something's wrong.
There's this intangible feeling that you can't actually explain to other people. And even when I had the accident, before anybody had, contacted or we had gotten to somewhere we can make phone calls, she had already been calling all of my friends that lived in Sydney.
Did anyone talk to her? Because
I
I never had such an intense feeling of somewhat like pain, but it wasn't my pain. It was her pain, so I couldn't verbalize it, so it must have been my sister.
It's a perfect example of when you call it, you have a sixth sense.
There have been a number of experiments in dream telepathy when a person is still, quiet, in a meditative state, or in sensory deprivation, or in a dream state. They seem to be more receptive. So this is a rather famous dream researcher and telepathy researcher, Stanley Krippner, talking about early experiments in dream telepathy.
A picture by a Japanese artist, Hiroshige, called Downpour at Shono, showing this cold man with a little umbrella above his head walking on this Japanese mountain. And not only did the psychologist have to look at the picture, the psychologist had to go into the shower and take a cold shower that night. The dreamer dreamed about Japan, dreamed about a rainstorm, dreamed about a mountain, dreamed about everything that was on that picture.
In all, the studies at Maimonides lasted nearly 10 years. Krippner and his colleagues used hundreds of subjects in the most systematic attempt to study dream telepathy ever made.
We did find evidence of an anomalous phenomena, something that was very difficult to explain through ordinary means. If people want to use the word telepathy to explain it, fine. All that we're saying is it was something that beat the laws of chance, sometimes by 20 to 1, sometimes by 100 to 1, sometimes by 1,000 to 1.
So there is a procedure called the Ganzfeld procedure, whereby the person is put in a kind of sensory deprivation state, and then images or information are sent to this receiver. So here's a little bit more about the Ganzfeld procedure.
Way of reproducing the original dream telepathy studies.
In the Ganzfeld procedure, we put somebody into a state of mild sensory deprivation. So we put half ping pong balls over their eyes and shine a red light onto their face. The headphones they wear carry white noise. And what that does is direct all their attention inwards. So they ignore external stimuli and they suddenly become very sensitive to internal ideas and images. And for about 20 minutes, we ask them just to tell us about the ideas and thoughts that go through their mind.
And I carry on rising up into the sky. And I can see islands.
At the same time, someone else in another room concentrates on some kind of target. There might be a picture postcard or a video clip. And what we're looking for is some kind of match-up between the nature of that target and what the person who's in the Ganzfeld state is saying.
In Ganzfeld studies, like this one at the University of Edinburgh, the matches between the target video pictures and the dreamlike images of the subjects consistently exceed chance.
What we see in the Ganzfeld is, in my own research, 47% response rate, which is almost double what you'd expect by chance. If it's a coincidence in this lab, then it's also a striking coincidence that is happening in other labs worldwide. It's not the result of one experimenter or one experiment. It's many, many people doing many, many studies. And this builds an incredibly persuasive database.
Speaking of databases, these are some of those labs where the Ganzfeld procedure was tested: Stanford, Princeton, Amsterdam, Edinburgh Institute of Parapsychology. And all the effect sizes you see to your right are statistically significant effects. So there is a substantial database. Now, here is something strange. There is, of course, you know that telepathy is not accepted as part of academic American psychology. So there's a bulletin, a very, very conservative, peer-reviewed journal called Psychological Bulletin. And they write review articles about, like, object relations. They'll write an article, a team of people will write an article that really brings the reader up to a contemporaneity of a knowledge of that particular discipline. So they had such an article about telepathy. And you would expect that in this journal they would say it's just junk science. But the authors of this study and the editor made a very rare statement where they actually almost endorsed it. Now, this is academic prose, but this is revolutionary. Here's what they said. We believe that the replication rates, this is academic prose, so get used to it here. We believe that the replication rates and effect sizes achieved by one particular experimental method, the Ganzfeld procedure, are now sufficient to warrant bringing this body of data to the attention of the wider psychological community. Well, how close to an endorsement is that? Well, there were lots of letters to the editor that said you should not have published that article. That is not acceptable. And there was a great deal of uproar over it. Okay, but there's at least one example of academic psychology actually breaking out of its mold. So I gave this talk to one that you're seeing. I gave this talk at the University of Lund in Sweden at the invitation of Professor Etzel Cardina. He's a tenured professor in Sweden. He's an American, and he invited me, and I thanked him for having me talk in front of his class. He used to be the president of the American Parapsychological Association, which is not the American Psychological Association. It's not recognized. And I asked him a question. I said, thank you, Etzel, for inviting me to your class. I wanted to ask you, how many tenured professors in the United States are there who offer classes in parapsychology? He said, about 3. 3. Parapsychology is generally not mentioned in introductory psychology texts. You don't get grants in this area. You certainly are not going to get tenure very easily if you're interested in this area. So it is really still a very, very taboo subject. Now, there are a couple of facts here that nonetheless need to be observed. For example, 60% of Americans believe they have experienced ESP. Okay, 25% of Americans believe they have experienced telepathy. So if you're not interested in that because you do not believe it could ever happen and there's no mechanism of transfer, that's 77 million discarded pieces of data that academic psychology wants to go blah, 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 and not hear anything about. Our third taboo, psychic dreams. I dreamt something that came true. I can't believe that I did. I saw something in my dream that somehow broke the barriers of space and time and transported me or my consciousness into the future. And I saw something that came true. And I was amazed by that experience. That's what a psychic or precognitive dream is. So here's an example of one. There are, in my book, I'm trying to give all fresh examples in this talk, but so that none of the examples in my book appear in this video. But there are probably 30 examples of psychic dreams in my book. Let's do one. So Laura Hatch is 16 years old. She gets along well with her parents. She goes out on a prom. She's expected to stay out late, but she doesn't come home. She doesn't come home and she's missing. And after 2 days, her mother and father are panicked. They put out an APB. The police are looking for her. They think, well, she probably ran away from home. And they said, no, our daughter would not run away. She's missing. Please help us find her. 7 days pass. No one has found Laura Hatch or her car. Laura Hatch's good friend, her mother, is named Shaw Noor, and she's very Christian, and she's praying for some kind of spiritual guidance to try to find Laura Hatch. Where is she? And she receives a message in her dream that she is supposed to go to this particular location. She and her daughter drive their car to a ravine, which she saw in her dream, okay? And they see nothing. There's nothing there, and they're ready to get back in the car, and then she hears a voice that says, go further, go further. So she climbs over the guardrail and starts walking down the ravine, following the voices of her dream. And there is Laura Hatch's car, completely invisible from the road, and Laura Hatch is sitting in her car 7 days later. And Shaw Noor comes up to her and she says, Laura? And Laura wakes up out of a coma and she says, am I late? Am I late? Oh my God, am I late for getting home? 7 days had passed. And Laura Hatch wakes up from a coma and there she is. So this appeared on television. Shaw Noor said, people tried, of course, immediately debunkers are there, skeptics are there. This cannot happen. Okay, there's an entire zeitgeist around the fact that these psychic phenomena cannot happen. And she was confronted with, and she said, when she was confronted by skeptics and debunkers, she said, they don't want to believe. They're scared that it could be true. What did they think I did? Place the girl out there? But no, Shaw Noor found her. Okay, how do you explain it? There are lots of people who say we have to explain this away. And that is the zeitgeist of academic psychology and why this is a taboo. It must be explained away so that we can maintain our paradigm that the soul is the mind is the brain, and there is nothing else. So I want to give you a few more psychic dreams. This is connected to 9/11. Carl Jung argues that when there are great important moments in collective psychology, psychic dreams and synchronicities are often generated. The night before 9/11, I dreamt I was in an airplane and it was crashing into a wall or barrier over and over all night long. I remember thinking it wouldn't hurt once I hit the wall. I just had to get past that point, then it wouldn't hurt anymore. It was a scene that kept playing over and over all night long. Psychic dream. I dreamt of 9/11 3 weeks before it occurred. I saw huge chunks of concrete falling from the sky with thick clouds of smoke. I woke in the middle of the night, heart pounding, terrified, and told my family that something terrible was going to happen. Here's a psychic dream told by a man, which is absolutely baffling. It's a YouTube. I had trouble finding this guy, but I did. I'll tell you why later.
And I saw fog, and I was looking out from the vantage point in Brooklyn across to lower Manhattan, and the fog was kind of clearing. And then as the fog was clearing, I saw a siren and 911, which I took to mean emergency. putting it together with the siren, and I was hearing sirens and noises like this. And then I see over Lower Manhattan in the fog, I see this image that looks like two paper cutout images of the dinosaur, the pterodactyl, and it was and these two paper cutouts reminded me of like a Matisse cutout where we're going back and forth over Lower Manhattan, where I could see the World Trade Centers, which was the main image you would see in the skyline of Lower Manhattan, and these pterodactyls were going back and forth over the Lower Manhattan area. And again, I took them to mean that these were planes, but it was funny later after, to me, after when 9/11 finally happened, that words that my subconscious was throwing out with that of a pterodactyl being a terror-dactyl, the kind of funny play.
So just to clarify, I wanted to get more clarification from this dream. It happens 2 years before 9/11, but he sees 911. I called him up and I said, how did you see that? I mean, that's very prophetic that your dream is actually saying the date of this event 2 years hence. He said he saw it as like a billboard. As he was looking out over this landscape of Lower Manhattan, he saw a billboard that said 911, and he took it to mean 911 emergency. Okay, very interesting dream. So, how many people have them? One study showed that 18% of adults said they experienced a psychic or precognitive dream like that. Another large survey showed 66% experienced a dream that came true. But there's one guy named Rydell who said, wait, if my grandfather is sick and I dream that he dies and then the next day he dies, that's very logical. That's expected. It's probable. I don't want to call that a psychic or precognitive dream. So he tried to refine his criteria for what a genuine precognitive dream would be. And he came up with a figure that 8% of the people he studied had genuine precognitive dreams that fit that more authentic set of criteria. So, psychologists are not interested in the fact that you have a dream that anticipates the future because the psyche cannot break the barriers of space and time. That is how we see the psyche. It just cannot do that, and so we don't want to hear about these things. Anyone who wants to study psychic dreams, you could study them in terms of dreamers being crazy. That man who saw Brooklyn, that dream, well, you can talk about his having some kind of a mental illness, that's okay. But the fact that the psyche can see into the future, impossible. We choose to believe that that is impossible, and therefore it's a taboo. Okay? Now there's a fourth taboo called synchronicity. This is acausal, pure coincidences, which are mysterious in the fact that two events seem to be connected in some way, and then at the same time, it's impossible that they could be connected. Jung talked about this. He worked out the theory of synchronicity with a quantum physicist, Wolfgang Pauli. So these are not just regular coincidences, they're pure coincidences, acausal, non-causal correlations between events, very similar to what goes on in physics and is called entanglement or non-locality. So, for example, on the first anniversary of 9/11, the New York State Lottery winning numbers were 911. That's an example of a pure coincidence, all right? And then you say, well, what's the meaningful connection between these two events? To Jung, the connection is archetypal, that this was a very big injury to the American national character, and it is symbolized in this synchronistic event that occurs a year later. So I want to give you a few examples. There are dozens in my book. Two ladies named Michaela and Emily. One was from San Francisco, the other was from San Diego. They were about the same age, 1 year apart. They both chose to go to Tulane. How coincidental. They both enjoyed theater. How coincidental. Both had got parts in a student production called The Vagina Monologues. How interesting. Both bought the same black fleece jacket on the same weekend. Curious. Both had mothers who used the same anonymous sperm donor. Whoa. So they became friends. They hung out together, and then they said, you know, we could be sisters. Wouldn't that be something if we were sisters? Because my mother also used an anonymous sperm donor. And then they learned it was a guy from Colombia. And the other girl learned it was a guy from Colombia. They said, well, it was the same guy.
College freshmen Michaela Stern-Ellis and Emily Nappy had a few things in common: their sense of style, love of theater and science, and the decision to trek all the way from California to Louisiana to attend Tulane University, their perfect school. It was at Tulane that they met this fall, became friends, and soon realized they shared something else quite unique. They were both conceived through anonymous sperm donors from Colombia, South America. Hearing the story and seeing the resemblance in pictures, Michaela's mom suggested the girls compare donor numbers. And lo and behold,
golly, sisters.
Sisters. Bound by friendship, blood, and destiny, Michaela just changed her Facebook page and profile picture to show the world her best birthday present ever. Michaela Stern-Ellis and Emily Nappy are with us now. Sisters, good morning. How are you?
Good morning.
Does that still catch you off guard, sisters?
Yeah,
definitely.
It's definitely weird. It's so crazy, just like walking around campus calling each other sister.
It's one coincidence after the other. You guys.
So that's an example of synchronicity, and Jung makes a very deep statement about these things. They shouldn't be discarded. They should be really looked at carefully. So here's a man, and Robert Anton Wilson, a sage, an American sage. Here's a few things that he talks about.
To that has been to repeat for the last 30 years, it was only a coincidence, it was only a coincidence, it was only a coincidence. And a bolder audience, I don't have to define a mantra. You all know what a mantra is. This is the mantra of what I call fundamentalist materialism, which is what my new book, The New Inquisition, is about. It's about fundamentalist materialism. I know it's more fashionable to attack fundamentalist Christianity right now, but I thought the fundamentalist materialists have been getting away with too much, and somebody should reveal that they're out with no clothes on, like the king in Andersen's Tale. And so I started researching some of their more notorious bloopers. I assume you all know what I mean by fundamentalist materialism. It is that school of materialism which is like unto fundamentalist religion in that it is absolutely dogmatic and sure of itself in all respects and has no doubts about it. They have their own mantra, and it works just like an ordinary Hindu mantra. It quiets anxieties, it stills the restless mind, it ends the perpetual inquiring and questioning and wondering, and eventually it stops thought entirely. Their mantra is, it was only a coincidence, it was only a coincidence, it was only a coincidence.
So indeed, synchronicity is another example of what the Church of Fundamentalist Materialism, which is how this video begins, and that psychology lives fully and completely inside this orthodoxy, all right? And anything that does not fit the orthodoxy is excluded and called all sorts of names, from junk science to voodoo. So here's another strange example of synchronicity and a psychic dream going hand in hand.
No soundtrack from the 1970s is complete without Leonard Skinner classics, Sweet Home Alabama, Freebird, and Tuesday's Gone. But the cast of characters that made the sound so memorable was bigger than most people realize. Deborah Jo Billingsley was one of Skinner's 3 backup singers known as the Honkettes. Ronnie asked her to meet them immediately in Greenville, South Carolina.
While I was talking to him on the phone, I heard this one word, and that word was wait. Wait.
You heard that inside you?
Yeah, wait.
She agreed to meet them a few days later at the Little Rock show. Then that night,
you had a dream.
Yes.
What was the dream?
I saw the plane crash. It was like the most vivid dream I've ever had. It was like in Technicolor. And I saw the plane, you know, and then I saw it smack the ground. I was like, oh, and I woke up screaming, and my mom ran in there. She said, honey, what in the world's wrong? And I said, Mom, I dreamed the plane crashed. It's just a dream. Go back to sleep. And I thought, I can't.
The next evening, the plane carrying 26 people, Leonard Skinner and their entourage, crashed in Mississippi. 6 people, including lead singer Ronnie Van Zant, guitarist Steve Gaines, and his sister, fellow backup singer Cassie Gaines, were killed. Deborah remembers getting a hysterical call from her brother.
He said, the plane has crashed and Ronnie is dead. I'm like, oh my God, you know, it was horrible. And right then, I looked on the television, the news, you know, special bulletin, Leonard Skinner plane crashed. And I was like, oh my God. You know, it's like I'd been drinking them and I sobered up like boom.
How did you reflect on your own personal life at that point?
I just thought, why have I been spared?
So that's only half the story. That's a psychic dream. And she acted upon it and saved her life and didn't get on that plane. But the synchronicity we haven't discovered yet. Watch this. They had released a record and they were beginning their tour. Their record label had produced the cover of their CD months before the plane crash. And that was the cover of their CD that they were about ready to start promoting. Look at the flames. So I asked, I think I emailed her, and I said, are those flames around the guy who actually died? And the answer is yes. So this CD cover is quite prophetic that these people are going to die by burning to death in a plane crash months in the future. Now, they didn't release this CD with that cover. It would have been bizarre and grotesque. So this was the ultimate CD cover posthumously. After this was their CD cover that was released after that crash, and they obviously discarded the first one. So that is a synchronistic event here. That is a prophetic event. Now, remember this man who talked about the World Trade Center? Well, I noticed something peculiar in his YouTube video. I noticed that the video was precisely 9 minutes and 11 seconds long, and I thought, I got to ask this guy this question. And I really had taken a long time to try to find him, but I did find him. And that's when I asked him about seeing 9/11, and he said, I saw it as a billboard. And I said, well, did you make your video to be 9 minutes and 11 seconds long? I mean, that's a little crazy. He said, no. When you upload a video to YouTube, they condense it, and it just came out 9/11. I didn't plan it. Okay, so that is another synchronistic event about 9/11, premonitions, dreams, synchronicity. Okay, these things are piling up on each other, aren't they? So more on the Inquisition that Anton Williams talks about. From the Church of Fundamentalist Materialism. These are labels that we live with daily as we confront psychic experiences, synchronicity, telepathy, and all the other taboos that we will still be talking about. But these are the labels that keep hitting us that make us very, very self-conscious. It's flaky. It's New Age psychobabble. It's deceitful. It's woolly-mindedness. It's unscientific. It's delusion. It's poppycock. It's voodoo. It's pseudoscience. It's fraud. It's superstitious. It's trickery. It's magic. It's ridiculous. It's wish fulfillment. It's junk science. It's occultism. It's hallucinations. It's coincidence, coincidence, coincidence. So, once you get past all those labels, you realize, I don't want to share my experience with other people. They'll think I'm crazy. 67% of Americans say they have had an inner, spiritual, or paranormal experience that they do not feel they can share with others because they don't want to be called crazy. All right? Now, that is the zeitgeist under which we live to this day. It is not only out in our popular culture, but it's in firmly entrenched in academic psychology. So let's talk about some more taboos, and this one is called xenoglossy. Chester Carlson invented the Xerox machine, xerography, made a lot of money, and funded a chair. He was interested in reincarnation, and he funded a chair, a professor in Virginia. His name was Ian Stevenson, and no university would normally have a professor who studied these things, but this was Chester Carlson's big endowment, and so Ian Stevenson took it, and he was a very serious psychologist, and he wanted to study not only reincarnation, but what is called xenoglossy, which is a person's ability to speak a foreign language out without ever having learned it. Certain people in hypnosis will start babbling, and it turns out to be a language they never studied and never learned. A friend of mine who is a psychotherapist in Santa Barbara hypnotized a patient, and she started talking in an Indian dialect. He was never able to pinpoint it, but he said it's either Chumash or Choctaw. All right, but she had a great-great-grandmother who was a Native American. That's all she knew. She never learned any language. She never heard any stories. Okay. But all these things immediately have to be debunked, because you cannot have in your head anything other than what you learned or what you inherited biologically. Any other kind of transmission of so-called transpersonal experiences, sorry, we don't go there. Now, there's another story which some of these stories are just so unbelievable. This is a story from from Britain. A woman who speaks only English is the secretary of a businessman in London. And this businessman is having an appointment with a man from Greece named Mr. Papadopoulos. I don't know his real name. I just made Papadopoulos up, but I didn't make up this story. So Mr. Papadopoulos comes into the office. The secretary says, "Hello, Mr. Papadopoulos." And she opens the door and leads him in to the office where her boss is. Shuts the door, comes back, and sits down at her desk. Okay? Then mysteriously, she gets up from her desk, walks into the office, opens the door, interrupts the boss and his client, and starts speaking Greek. And she says, "Mr. Papadopoulos, your son has just been killed in a motorcycle accident in Athens." She says that in perfect Greek, and then she faints and falls on the floor. The boss and Papadopoulos rush to her aid and try to rouse her. She doesn't remember anything that happened. And then Papadopoulos says, "My God, what did you just say? That's terrible." And the guy said, her boss said, "What did she say? What did she say?" He said, "She said in Greek that my son died in a motorcycle accident." And he calls immediately right from there to Athens to his wife and says, "What happened?" And she said, "How do you know? How do you know?" "I just found out our son has been killed in a motorcycle accident, and I was almost ready to call you." Okay, now you could say, debunkers, please come into the room and say, "Well, that couldn't have happened. It couldn't have happened. It didn't happen. False reporting." You have 10 good reasons why you can reject that. But what about the possibility that that actually happened, that is a true story? So if that is a true story, then what is the theory that we have of the psyche that can do things like that? Okay, if we open that door, we have to open the door wide and say, my God, we don't have a theory of the psyche which deals with those kind of problems. We would rather not hear about them. That's the attitude of academic psychology in the United States. Now, premonitions are sixth taboo. Sometimes premonitions often come in dreams. They're like psychic dreams, but you can have conscious premonitions as well, where you have a sense that something is going to happen, and it does. Sometimes those things are predicted, and sometimes they're totally unpredicted, and it's the unpredicted ones that we're kind of interested in. Here's a conscious premonition. My son was about 9 years old at the time, and the date was September 10th, not September 11th. My children and I were stopped by a reporter asking people what then President Bush should do because his ratings were so low. My son was photographed and his video was used on that evening's news. He said sternly, "He needs to make airplanes and the sky safer against terrorists. People are going to get killed." The next day was 9/11. That counts as a premonition. This premonition, you're going to think this is fraudulent. It is so outrageous. This is Alec Guinness, the actor, talking about another actor.
You also met Dean, didn't you, James?
Well,
Dean?
my very first night in Hollywood, I met James Dean. It was a very, very odd occurrence. I'd arrived off the plane, but those were, it took a long time in those days, about 16 hours flight. And I'd been met by Grace Kelly and various people, but I found that I was alone for myself for the evening. And a woman I knew phoned up and said, "Let me take you out to dinner." And we went to various places, and she was wearing trousers, and they wouldn't let her in any of the smart Hollywood restaurants. Think of it, whatever it was, 1952, 54, something like that. However, we finally went to a little Italian dive, and that was full. And so one got turned away. I said, "Honestly, I don't mind just a hamburger anyway." I was hungry by then. And then I heard feet running down the street, and it was James Dean. And he said, "I was in that restaurant, you couldn't get a table. And my name's James Dean." He said, "Will you come and join me?" So we said, yes, very kind of him. And then going back into the restaurant, he said, "Oh, before we go in, I must show you something. I've just got a new car." And there in the courtyard of this little restaurant was I don't know what the car was, some little silver, very smart thing, all done up in cellophane with a bunch of roses tied to its bonnet. And I said, "How fast can you drive in this?" He said, "Oh, I can do 150 in it." And I said, "Have you driven it?" He said, "No, I've never been in it at all." And some strange thing came over me, some almost different voice. And I said, "Look, I won't join your table unless you want me to, but I must say something. Please do not get into that car, because if you do," and I looked at my watch, and I said, "If you get into that car at all, it's now Thursday, whatever the date was, 10 o'clock at night, and by 10 o'clock at night next Thursday, you'll be dead if you get into that car." I said, "Oh, nonsense." So we had dinner, we had a charming dinner, and he was dead the following Thursday afternoon in that car. It was one of those odd things.
Has it ever happened to you before?
No, I'm glad to say. And it was one of a very, very odd, spooky experience. He was I liked him very much too. I'd love to have known him more.
So, I mean, when you hear that story, you have to say, "Oh, he's making that up. He's confabulating. This is too outrageous to believe." And, of course, the skeptics and the debunkers will say, "Oh, they're blah, 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 blah." But there's always the possibility that this man was telling the truth and that he had some kind of a voice take over when he met James Dean, and that voice spoke through him and told James Dean of a premonition, a conscious premonition, that he would be dead the following week if he got in that car. In fact, he did get in that car, had an accident, and that was the end of James Dean. So if you accept this story as truthful, then you have to enter a whole new area of understanding of the psyche. And we need to open up a lot of doors to say, "My God, what is going on?" Or if we stick and cling to our fundamentalist orthodoxy and say, "It just couldn't happen, and therefore it didn't happen because we don't want to believe it can happen, and we're not interested in exploring this at all." That's basically, however hilarious or facetious that may sound, that is basically the idea that comes with that taboo, the taboos of forbidden psychology today. So here's another database that has been ignored. In 1987, Chicago National Opinion Research Center reported 67% of Americans had an accurate premonition. That's 207 million people academic psychology is ignoring. Oh, if you want to write an article about people who have premonitions and how anxious they are, how mentally ill they are, how dysfunctional they are, that's fine. But if you want to write an article about how people actually do see into the future, we're not publishing that, okay? Because we're very scared of being called unscientific, and that sounds unscientific to us. Seventh taboo, creative possession. Paul McCartney is at the estate of the people who make the beer in Ireland, the dark beer, Guinness, and there's a big lake there. He wakes up and he has this song going through his head, and he said to John Lennon, "Who wrote this song? This is an incredible song. Who wrote it?" John Lennon said, "You did. It was yesterday." Frank Sinatra called it the most beautiful love song ever written. It came to Paul McCartney in a dream. Bach said, "I don't write my music. God writes my music." Okay? He considered it an example of divine possession, as if something takes over in you and gives this stuff to you. So Giuseppe Tartini had a dream of, he was a violinist, and he said the devil came to him in his dream and played this trill. He called it the devil's trill. What I wrote down in the morning was nothing but a shrunken vestige of what I heard in my dream. Here's a sample of a song that came to Giuseppe Tartini called The Devil's Trill. So there's another, a more conscious form of being possessed by something that appears outside of you. Jay Greenberg is 12 years old. He's a musical prodigy. He goes to Juilliard at the age of 12. He hears things and writes them down. He hears symphonies. And they're going to perform one in this 60 Minutes broadcast. Jay Greenberg doesn't feel that he creates this music. He feels that it comes from outside. He feels like he's a scribe and he's simply writing down what he hears. Something is coming into his psyche from outside his psyche. That's taboo in psychology. No, no, no. It's got to come from inside. It can't come from outside. There's no possible means of transmission.
There's a composer studying at New York's renowned Juilliard School who some say is the greatest talent to come along in 200 years. He's written 5 full-length symphonies, and listen to this, he's 12 years old. He's a kid named Jay Greenberg, although he likes to sign his work Blue Jay because, as he told us, blue jays are small and they make a lot of noise. Jay says that the music just fills his head and he has to write it down to get it out. What's going on in Blue Jay's head? Have a listen. A 12-year-old wrote this. He wrote every note for each and every instrument, and the really amazing part is he wrote it in just a few hours. The piece is called The Storm. It was commissioned by the New Haven Symphony in Connecticut. And when the last note sailed into the night, Jay Greenberg navigated an unfamiliar stage, past musicians who'd been playing longer than he'd been alive, and Blue Jay took his bow.
We haven't seen his like in how long?
Hundreds of years, probably 200 years.
We are talking about a prodigy of the level of the greatest prodigies in history when it comes to composition. I'm talking about the likes of Mozart and Mendelssohn and Saint-Saëns.
Sam Zeman is a composer. He teaches music theory to Jay at Juilliard in New York City, where he's been teaching for 17 years.
This is an absolute fact.
Jay Greenberg hears things, and they seem to him to come from outside his system. Beethoven would write his compositions, and then he would scratch them out and edit them until they were perfect. That's not what Jay Greenberg does. Jay Greenberg seems to write his music out the first time he heard it, that's it, period. He doesn't seem to edit it. He doesn't cross things out and say, maybe I should change that. He's only 12 years old. But what he hears is far beyond the mentality and the emotional maturity of a 12-year-old. So, in a sense, there is a transpersonal dimension outside of one's own personal experience. Okay? There is a great deal of evidence in psychology, but it is not recognized by academic psychology, where some individual seems to peek out from his own learning and his own phenomenal experience and access things that simply do not appear in his own background. The case of Bridie Murphy in my book is an example. A convict in an Ohio penitentiary who was starting to speak Serbian. There are many such examples of these outside archives of psychic experience that are channeled in some way inside a person's being. That's outside. That's taboo. So now we come upon our 8th taboo. It's a little softer. There are places in American psychology which tolerate a discussion of these items. Most academic psychologists say, oh no, this has been discredited. That's their favorite word, discredited. But there are places, a little nook or cranny that you can fit this in. The idea is from Jung that there are cross-cultural human characteristics. Every culture from Mongolia to the Philippines has an image of a hero. And those hero images, they are obviously psychological. The heroes tend to go through certain trials and tribulations. This was Joseph Campbell's first book, A Hero with 1,000 Faces. So are there cross-cultural psychological qualities that belong to the architecture of the human psyche? Let's get a feeling for Joseph Campbell, who was really quite expert in this area, and how the relationship of myth, metaphor, archetype, and collective psychology kind of join hands.
To think that the symbolic statement refers to a historical fact, and the two prime ones that are troubling our world are the image of the virgin birth, which has nothing to do with the biological problem, and the image of the promised land, which has nothing to do with real estate. These are symbols of the birth in the heart of a spiritual life.
So Campbell's approach was to look at myths and trying to tease out the inherent psychological meaning of what they meant. So let's take a look at one cross-cultural item, and that is the fact that human beings have always had a preoccupation, if not an obsession, with beings from the stars, star people who come to Earth, who are deified, who promise things, a second coming, and who leave. From Zeus to Jesus to Dionysius, there they are, at least 48 such sky gods. So they come from virtually every culture on Earth: Egyptian, Sumerian, Japanese, Greek, African, Samoan, Maori, Chinese, Japanese, Mesoamerican. So what does it mean that that human beings have these obsessions with the gods. Well, according to contemporary psychology, and certainly Richard Dawkins, it's a sign that Homo sapiens is mentally ill. The God delusion. There is no God, and so human beings are superstitious, backward, uneducated, and they believe in these crazy things. Sam Harris follows this point of view. There are a couple problems with this prevailing point of view, and that is that human beings have been burying their dead with tools and toys and things for the afterlife for at least 50,000 years, and recent data suggests that it may go back as far as 100,000 years. Why has our species been mentally ill for that length of time? Homo sapiens, according to these people, is the only mentally unstable primate. Richard Dawkins says the God delusion is a virus of the mind. Well, that virus is between 50,000 and 100,000 years old. Chimpanzees, bonobos, dolphins have very similar. By the way, Neanderthal had a larger brain than we do, and those other primates have very evolved cognitive capacities and brain systems, and yet none of them engage in that behavior. Why is it that we are the only primate that engages in that behavior? The contemporary point of view is that's because we are mentally ill, collectively. Is there another set of Joseph Campbell-like interpretations of this cross-cultural thing? Well, one could be that there might be something true about it. Homo sapiens maybe has had encounters with star people. Oh, really? That's taboo. That's not scientific, is it? Or another meaning is there is another world, a spiritual world, which influenced and influences mankind. It's hard to believe that 76% of the population of human beings on this planet today believes that after you die, your soul leaves your body and goes somewhere else. Maybe they don't call it a soul, but the idea of an afterlife penetrates 3/4 of the human race today, and probably has gone on for 50,000 years in some form or another. Another meaning could be that man's destiny has something to do with this other world. So we have, in toto, 8 taboos that we've covered: synchronicity, near-death experiences, premonitions, telepathy, archetypes, creative possession. The question is, how do we make sense of this? Do they fall together in any way? Is there some kind of theory which will put all of this together for us? If we looked at all of the forbidden sides of psychology, is it saying anything consistent across all of these little 8 subject matters? I think the best way to do it is to start looking at physics. Physics has always impressed psychology, all the way back to the psychophysics of Wilhelm Wundt. So let's take a look at contemporary physics, because they have struggled with some mysteries, and it'll be interesting how they've handled their problems. Let's take a look at some mysteries in quantum physics. Being in 2 places at the same time. Ooh, that's kind of impossible in psychology. Observer-created reality, how solipsistic can you be? The EPR paradox, the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen paradox, entanglement and non-locality. Let's take a peek at one aspect of this.
And here we are, the granddaddy of all quantum weirdness, the infamous double-slit experiment. To understand this experiment, we first need to see how particles, or little balls of matter, act. If we randomly shoot a small object, say a marble, at the screen, we see a pattern on the back wall where they went through the slit and hit. Now, if we add a second slit, we would expect to see a second band duplicated to the right. Now, let's look at waves. The waves hit the slit and radiate out, striking the back wall with the most intensity directly in line with the slit. The line of brightness on the back screen shows that intensity. This is similar to the line the marbles make. But when we add the second slit, something different happens. If the top of one wave meets the bottom of another wave, they cancel each other out. So now there is an interference pattern on the back wall. Places where the two tops meet are the highest intensity, the bright lines, and where they cancel, there is nothing. So, when we throw things, that is, matter, through two slits, we get this, two bands of hits. And with waves, we get an interference pattern of many bands. Good so far. Now, let's go quantum. An electron is a tiny, tiny bit of matter, like a tiny marble. Let's fire a stream through one slit. It behaves just like the marble, a single band. So, if we shoot these tiny bits through two slits, we should get, like the marbles, two bands. What? An interference pattern. We fired electrons, tiny bits of matter through. But we get a pattern like waves, not like little marbles. How? How could pieces of matter create an interference pattern like a wave? It doesn't make sense. But physicists are clever. They thought, maybe those little balls are bouncing off each other and creating that pattern. So, they decide to shoot electrons through one at a time. There is no way they could interfere with each other. But after an hour of this, the same interference pattern is seen to emerge. The conclusion is inescapable. The single electron leaves as a particle, becomes a wave of potentials, goes through both slits, and interferes with itself to hit the wall like a particle. But mathematically, it's even stranger. It goes through both slits, and it goes through neither. And it goes through just one, and it goes through just the other. All of these possibilities are in superposition with each other. But physicists were completely baffled by this. So they decided to peek and see which slit it actually goes through. They put a measuring device by one slit to see which one it went through and let it fly. But the quantum world is far more mysterious than they could have imagined. When they observed, the electron went back to behaving like a little marble. It produced a pattern of two bands, not an interference pattern of many. The very act of measuring or observing which slit it went through meant it only went through one, not both. The electron decided to act differently, as though it was aware it was being watched. And it was here that physicists stepped forever into the strange netherworld of quantum events. What is matter? Marbles or waves? And waves of what? And what does an observer have to do with any of this? The observer collapsed the wave function simply by observing.
So, quantum mechanics starts to explore its mysteries, but it does so in a very inquisitive, scientific, and open-minded way. This really created a problem with cosmology, and certainly with the devolution of the clockwork universe. So let's now take a look at an even more exotic quantum element, which has a strong relationship to the psychology that we have been sort of developing here: entanglement and non-locality.
Entanglement crushes our experience of space. Two objects, two electrons created together, are entangled. Send one to the other side of the universe. Now, do something to one, and the other responds instantly. Instantly. So, either information is traveling infinitely fast, or, in reality, they are still connected. They are entangled. And since everything was entangled at the moment of the Big Bang, that means everything is still touching. Space is just the construct that gives the illusion that there are separate objects. Are we far enough down the rabbit hole yet?
Here are some quotes. As physicists have in effect destroyed the clockwork universe of Newton, which is the universe of fundamentalism and materialism and reductionism that psychology is still bound by. Here are some quotes from famous physicists. Anyone who is not shocked by quantum theory has not understood a single word. Niels Bohr. From the standpoint of our quantum mechanics, says Max Born, there is no quantity which causally fixes the effect of a collision in an individual event. I myself am inclined to renounce determinism in the atomic world. Did you hear that? He is of the impression that cause and effect do not work in certain aspects of the quantum world. Brian Greene, a modern, a superb writer and a string theorist, says, it is harder to train your mind to have quantum mechanical intuition because quantum mechanics shatters our own personal individual conception of reality. Something happens over here can be entwined with something that happens over there, even if nothing travels from here to there. And even if there isn't enough time for anything, even light, to travel between these events. Telepathy, synchronicity are psychological aspects of this idea of non-locality and entanglement. From Richard Feynman, consequently, action at a distance must have a close connection with field theory. The field, quantum field theory, psychological field theory, things exist in a whole which is greater than the sum of its parts. And it is the whole which appears to be determining, the field which appears to be determining the outcome of these events. From Amit Goswami, correlated quantum objects must be interconnected in a domain that transcends space and time. We're really getting far out, aren't we, when we talk about quantum physics? So here is a kind of a visionary, a wise man, Robert Anton Wilson, who's talking here about the meaning of non-locality and entanglement.
And is a non-local hidden variable. And what's a non-local hidden variable? The non-local hidden variable is spaceless and timeless, so it functions equally throughout space and equally throughout time. And John Bell did a rigorous mathematical demonstration of how a non-local hidden variable of the Bohm sort would have to behave if it existed. And believe it or not, this mathematical demonstration was clear enough that they could actually perform experiments to test it. And every time they've tested it, it's turned out the universe does behave, at least in physics laboratories, as if the non-local correlation does exist. And what this means is, as a friend of mine, a physicist named Nick Herbert, likes to say, there's absolutely no difference between anything. Or another of Nick's ways of explaining the non-local correlation is here is there. What this means is any two quantum entities that were once in contact continue to be correlated no matter how far apart they go, no matter how much time passes. They're always moving in harmony with each other, just like the dancers in a ballet. This begins to sound even more like Buddhism and Hinduism. There's only one thing happening, and everything is related to everything else. This not only sounds like Buddhism and Hinduism, it sounds like magic. Sir James Frazer in The Golden Bough defined magic as the primitive system of thought which believes that two things that were once connected continue to influence each other. This is why those into black magic believe if they can get a hold of a piece of your clothing or a hair from your head and do something to that, that will affect you. And Fraser calls this the first law of magic. Things once in contact continue to influence each other. Well, according to Bell's theorem and 7 experiments so far, the universe does work that way.
Well, those 7 experiments have been enlarged by the Chinese, and entanglement, quantum teleportation continue in the 21st century to exist and to be extended further and further across over 197 kilometers. They've found the same thing. If you measure this, that one changes instantly. So here are the mysteries that physics confronted, which undermined mechanistic reductionism and in some cases determinism itself. Entanglement, non-locality, observer-created reality, the multiple locations of an object at the same time, the uncertainty principle, Schrodinger's cat, quantum teleportation. All of those experimental outcomes confronted physics, and they had to struggle with it. Psychology has its own mysteries that undermine mechanistic reductionism and in some cases determinism itself. Synchronicity, telepathy, psychic dreams, premonition, creative possession, xenoglossy, near-death experiences, hypnotic anomalies, which we have not discussed in this video but are discussed in my book, archetypes. Those are psychology's mysteries. So, is there some kind of a theory out there of the psyche which includes these mysteries? Well, not if it's that forbidden, not if it's really politically incorrect for any legitimate academic psychologist to be working in any of these areas. So before we get into too much physics, I want to go back and bring us back to our roots. Okay, this is a psychological odyssey. So let me present you with one case. Most of the cases I give you here in this video are not in my book. This is one that comes from my book. The case of Dennis. So, because this illustrates almost everything that we're talking about. Dennis is, I met Dennis, he was in his 60s. He was a mayor of a small California coastal city. When he was 21, he was a surfer in Hawaii, and he hung out with his surfer buddies. He was originally from Boston. He woke up one morning. They were living in this little surfer cottage on the beach. It had almost paper-thin walls, he said. He was never into spearfishing. He was a surfer, period. But his roommate was a spear fisherman. So he was lying in bed one day and saying, well, I think I might go out to this beach. I think there are going to be some good waves out there. And just as he said that, a spear gun from the other room crashed through the wall, the paper-thin wall, and grazed the top of his head and hit the opposite wall and stuck in the wall. And he said, Jesus. And he said, you know, that was my closest encounter with death in my life. If I was a half of an inch further up in that bed, I would have been dead. That spear gun, it was very powerful. It would have gone right into my brain. So that afternoon, he gets a telegram from his mother in Boston. They didn't have email in those days. I think this is the 60s. And his mother's email said, please call me immediately. I need to talk to you. Call me immediately. He's afraid that somebody died or something. He calls his mother, long distance. She said, I had a terrible dream that you were killed by a spear gun. Are you okay? And he said, Ma, how did you know that? And he told her the story. So later on, he said, I tried to figure out she had a dream that he was killed by a spear gun. So it was a dream that she had. It was very terrifying to her, enough to send a telegram. He calculated that her dream occurred in actual real time, 2 hours before the spear gun in Hawaii creased the top of his head. So this is an example of telepathy. He said, I was always very close with my mother. Of psychic dreams, of a premonition, which didn't in this case come true, of synchronicity, of non-locality, and there are many, many psychic experiences that fit this kind of formula. So let's, I'd like to show you a kind of a distinguished Princeton-educated scientist who talks about how physics relates to all of these psychic experiences that we've been talking about here. This is Dean Radin.
You take this notion of an entangled universe and you apply it to human experience. Let's assume that experience is entangled, then how would it manifest? And we can start going through ways in which it could manifest. If there's a connection with another mind, we call it telepathy. If there's a connection to some other object somewhere else, we call it clairvoyance. If there's a connection that happens to transcend time, we call it precognition, of that sort. So you can go through a list of perhaps 12 kinds of psychic experience that have gotten labels over the years, like telepathy, but this is really just the tip of the iceberg.
Dean Radin's book, The Entangled Mind, begins the process of trying to bridge this gap between physics and psychology, and between physics and forbidden psychology. There's another issue that's ancillary to this, and that is the issue of reductionism. Physicists are now of the opinion that the quantum world is some kind of a field, perhaps a holographic field, where this interconnectedness of everything with everything exists. So let's begin the discussion with a famous physicist, David Bohm, who talks about the whole being greater than the sum of its parts.
We actually make up everything in the sense all these theories are made up by us, but in these theories we place the parts, we may either place the parts as fundamental or the whole as fundamental. Now the quantum mechanics is placing the whole as fundamental. That's, I think, the most basic change it makes, right?
Where do you see the limits of the Western worldview?
Well, just in the way of saying that it focuses too much on analysis and it tends to lead to fragmentation. You see, now what I mean by fragmentation is not just division, distinction, but because the parts in the whole are correlative concepts. You see, a part is a part only because it's part of a whole, like a machine or a watch, right? Now, a fragment is something it means break it up, you see. That's the root of the word, to smash, right? So if you smashed a watch, you would get fragments. Now, the Western view, it aims at getting the true parts of the universe, but in some ways, perhaps it gets fragments, not to some extent in physics, but much more so in fields like biology, psychology, sociology, and so on. Right? But now, if you break it up falsely into fragments, then you have confused. You see, you're going to treat these as separate when they're not, and also you're going to unite what's in the fragment when it's not united, right? So it leads to confusion.
So in the West, you tend to confuse the part for the whole and vice versa?
Yeah, you get confused about the part and the whole because you take a fragment as an independent whole.
The question is there any basis to think about a non-reductionistic psyche? We have covered 8 subject areas, and certainly physics has begun the process of abandoning reductionism. Can psychology follow in those footsteps? So let's take a look at what is called holism versus reductionism outside of physics. We have numerous examples of schools of fish that appear to belong to a greater unity that in fact may govern their own individual behaviors. Here's a short film of a school of fish, and take a look at how intricate the organization is of the whole. So you can see that this organization has a certain velocity. It's going counterclockwise. There's kind of a north pole, a kind of a south pole. Is this whole greater than the sum of the individual fish who are part of it? According to the holism approach, yes, it is. And it's the whole, the field, that is more important than the individual part.
Should be impossible.
Here are some birds flying in similar formation. Here's another example of if you take an ant and try to isolate that ant and keep an ant as a pet, the ant will die. The ant is a part of a larger entity that through it is almost just a cell in a larger body. So here's an example of a ball of fire ants which behave as a single material. Like a school of fish, these ants form some kind of an organic body of collective behavior. There are many countless examples. I want to give you one more: Kirlian photography. In Kirlian photography, an organic piece of material is laid on a photographic plate, and some kind of an aura, an emanation appears from that. But what the great discovery that came out of Kirlian photography is that if you cut a leaf, it retains its memory of what it was like before it was cut. You see leaves there that have been cut. Their Kirlian photograph shows the part of the leaf that is missing. So that means the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Here's a little more on Kirlian photography.
A weak current of electricity passing through the film to an object in direct contact with the film produces the picture.
And frustrating process, the search for the phantom leaf. And it was only after 2 years that we finally obtained this. Our procedure evolved so that we would cut a leaf directly from the plant. Then, before the leaf was ever placed on film, part of it was cut. It was then placed in contact with the 4x5 piece of film, covered with a piece of glass, and with a piece of copper backing. An electrode was attached to the stem of the leaf. Suddenly, the phantom. Not only do we see the edge where the leaf has been sharply cut, but continuing beyond where we assume the leaf would show had it not been cut away. This particular leaf has been cut in a pie shape. We can see that the phantom gradually emerges. When the emanations do emerge from where the leaf has been cut, it shows the same jet-like emission that the rest of the leaf reveals. Here is a phantom produced not in our laboratory, but by Mr. Robert Wagner at Cal State Long Beach. He chose an ivy leaf for this portrait, and very brilliantly one can see that the tip of the leaf is clearly visible, even though it has been cut.
So having viewed these examples of holistic systems, remember David Bohm, who said the whole is more fundamental than the part. Remember Feynman, who said that if we have action at a distance, it implies the existence of a field. So there are many examples of whole systems that seem to govern individual parts, and that the whole may be more fundamental than the parts and larger than the parts. But in psychology, could psyche exist as a field? We have the Higgs field in physics. Could psyche exist in a field, as a field, operating in such a way? It is the opposite of a reductionistic point of view. Now, here are all of the topics that we have talked about in this talk. And we asked earlier, are they in any way connected? Well, if you look carefully, the telepathy, premonitions, psychic dreams, and synchronicity point to the non-local and entangled character of the human psyche, that it appears to be able to transcend space and time in an unusual and mysterious way. When we talk about archetypes, creative possession, hypnosis, xenoglossy, where there seems to be the ability of the psyche to access material that it never experienced in the individual's lifetime. Think of Jay Greenberg, the scribe, who is hearing things and simply writing them down, states of possession, individuals under hypnosis who suddenly are speaking foreign languages which they never spoke, archetypes which seem to provide us a collective reservoir for individual psyches to somehow access. So the human psyche is not only non-local, it is also transpersonal. And yet, near-death experiences suggest that the human psyche is also transcendental, that it is not entirely dependent upon the brain, that it appears to leave the body, that consciousness transcends the limitations of the brain. So if these three components of the psyche exist, its non-local, transpersonal, and transcendental character, well, there was an old-fashioned name for this. It was called something. It was called the soul. That is what the psyche originally, what psychology means. That is the part that was stripped out of the study of the soul and eliminated and became forbidden. But our original ancient meaning of the soul includes this transcendental, non-local, and transpersonal character. So the idea is, how do we repatriate psyche and soul from the orthodoxy of fundamentalist Newtonian clockwork universe materialism and reductionism? So that's not an easy task. There are two varieties of prejudice against us doing that. If 98% of all psychologists are working in other areas, we are not going to come up with a unified theory of the psyche. All right, so let's take a look at the prejudices that exist inside academia versus popular prejudices that exist outside of it. First, here's how physics and psychology handled their mysteries. Physics, indeterminacy, entanglement, quantum teleportation, all of those mysteries, how did they deal with it? Well, they came up with Bell's theorem. They developed new paradigms. They have new interpretations of their cosmology called the Copenhagen interpretation. There was full discussion and disclosure in their journals about these new mysteries that had been discovered. Now, let's take a look at psychology. It has its mysteries: synchronicity, psychic dreams, telepathy, all of the things we talked about. How does psychology handle its mysteries? It handles it with skepticism, with ridicule, with the maintenance of its sclerotic orthodoxy, its taboos, censorship, excommunication, and by that I mean you're not going to get tenure if you work in those areas. So here's a curious case of just how thick the prejudice is in academia. John Mack was an MD, a psychoanalyst, a Harvard professor. He had tenure. He won a Pulitzer Prize, a great writer. And he was asked, he didn't believe in UFOs, and he was asked by a group of UFO debunkers if he would hypnotize, I think, 17 or 18 people who said they had been abducted by aliens. And the debunker said, "We'll pay you. We want you to write a report saying that these people are lunatics." And he said, well, that's an interesting project. I think I'll take it on. So he started his work with these people who didn't know each other. And they said they had been abducted by aliens. And then he came to a startling conclusion. He said, in trance, these people who didn't know each other were pretty much reporting the same things. And he started to think, this operates like a genuine traumatic experience. People who've had car accidents, who retrieve memories. He said, the narrative of these people acts and behaves as if it was a real experience. And he wrote a book on that subject. Well, Harvard came down on him like a rock. He was accused of validating the delusions of his patients. Why? Because there are no such things as aliens, and there are no such things as gods, and these things cannot happen because we don't believe they could happen. Therefore, they didn't. Therefore, you're crazy, like all of your patients. Well, they didn't call him crazy, but they did attempt to examine everything he had ever done on his curriculum vitae, his scholarship, his publications, his teaching. He spent $100,000 of his own money trying to defend himself over 10 years of inquisitions at Harvard. And he was killed in a freak car accident in London by a drunk driver. But before he died, he said, you know, I feel like Galileo. If I don't recant, I'm never going to get my reputation back. And he never did recant. But you don't cross the line very easily. So there are 13 million people who say they had an experience where they felt they left their bodies. There are 77 million Americans say they experienced telepathy. There are 24 million people who report pretty authentic psychic dreams. There are 207 million Americans who report having an accurate premonition. That's 321 million pieces of data that academic psychology throws out the window because it does not conform to the idea that the soul equals the mind equals the brain equals neuroscience, and everything psychological happens inside the skull. There is no field, there is no entanglement, no non-locality. Forget all that. We're still back with Isaac Newton, and we don't want to hear about that data. Okay, that is the thickness of the prejudice. But there's another form of prejudice too. A popular media which treats psyche as cartoon. There are lots of programs on television about paranormal, UFOs, near-death experiences, Dracula TV, Montel Williams and Sylvia Brown, afterlife television. Okay, psyche is treated in the popular media as if it was a cartoon. This does not help make this subject an object of serious intellectual inquiry. All right. Here is an excerpt of, if you remember Taxi, I think it was Taxi. This is Ignatowski, who was a kind of an LSD burned out taxi driver. He has a dream that Louis, the smaller guy in the series, he had a dream that Louis died, a psychic dream. And this is Louis's reaction. He goes to talk to Alex, who's the voice of reason.
Ignatowski's a boob. Nice can. Now listen, Louis. Repeat after me. Superstitions are... I almost apologize. Don't you dare. Don't do that. No, that is on the other side of this. I don't care. I want to see it. No. Louis, get away from the door. No. Get away from the door. No, Rita. No, Rita. No, get away from the door.
the subtext of this funny episode is that people who believe in psychic dreams are superstitious. Rational people like Alex know that psychic dreams are foolish, and only superstitious and ignorant people can believe that. That's kind of like the subliminal message here. There are other sideshows in the popular exploitation of psychic phenomena. Here's the New Age circus tent, if you will.
Hello. My name is Master Charles Cannon. Actually, I'm known by many names: the modern mystic, the electronic guru, and the high-tech master. Although I'm an ordained monk of the Vedic tradition, I'm a modernist. I'm the spiritual director of Synchronicity, the foundation for modern spirituality, and the originator of the synchronicity experience and high-tech meditation. Synchronicity Sanctuary is the headquarters of Synchronicity, the foundation for modern spirituality. Located in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Central Virginia, it is home to the Still Point Monastery, the Sanctuary Retreat Center, a retreat facility wherein one can attend retreats on modern spirituality, and also the Shrine of the Heart, a sacred place wherein the Blessed Mother currently appears.
So the Blessed Mother is appearing probably every Tuesday and Thursday at their retreat center. Synchronicity this, synchronicity that. None of this helps in developing a theory of modern cutting-edge psychology that includes, not excludes, the material we've covered in this talk. So I would like to explore the idea that the popular prejudice kind of underscores the subtext that people who believe in these things are idiots, they're stupid, they're superstitious, they're backward, they're uneducated, they're engaged in pseudoscience. So that discourages not only people from sharing experiences, but from anyone taking any of this seriously. So Dean Radin explores whether or not psychic experience really does fall in the realm of stupidity.
This has led within an orthodox science, within mainstream science, to the notion that people who believe in psychic phenomena are stupid. And what they mean by that is that they are not trained in the principles of science to be able to understand why such phenomena can't be true. So I call this the stupidity hypothesis. It's a testable hypothesis because what it says is if you look at the number of years of education that somebody has, there should be a negative correlation with the degree of belief in psychic phenomena. The more educated you are, the less you would believe. And this is the assertion that many skeptics will say. In fact, the National Science Foundation says this, essentially. They bemoan the fact of science education being so poor in the United States, and this is why people believe in lots of nonsense. Well, some of that is true. People are not very well educated in science, but they include in the mix psychic phenomena as an example of one of the crazy things that people believe because they're stupid. If you look at the actual data, you look at the survey data, you partition it by the number of years of education versus belief in things like ESP. It is not a negative correlation. And in fact, it's a significant positive correlation. What does that mean? That means that the more educated you are, the more likely you are going to believe in psychic phenomena. So in other words, you can test the stupidity hypothesis and it fails. You do the same sort of analysis and you do surveys for college professors. What percentage of college professors believe in things psychic? 60 to 70%. Well, they're not stupid. So the ignorance spin that is put on this is absolutely not true. Scientists, like many people, will become schizophrenic. They have personal, private beliefs that are developed because of their experience, but they don't talk about it in public. Because in public, at least within the academic world, you're not supposed to talk about it. And this is one of the few areas in academia where this taboo is not only strong, but has persisted for at least a century.
So, thank you, Dean Radin, for saying what this talk is all about, in effect. But for us to make a conclusion, I think there are a couple things to be said. First, when the vast majority of trained psychologists are really discouraged from entering into any discussion of these things, we are not going to come up with a genuinely viable theory, the way physicists have come up with string theory and Bell's theorem, and how they have developed theories to explain the mysteries that they have encountered. We are denying our experience, we are denying these mysteries, and we are not developing any theories whatsoever. We are steadfastly holding to the fact that neuroscience is the ultimate basis of all psychology, reductionism. And that is part of our paradigm, which we could just as easily call our prejudice. Now, there is another conclusion. That is that the psyche appears to be non-local, transpersonal, transcendental. Carl Jung, I would like him to end this lecture because he was interviewed in 1959. He was asked, do you think there's life after death? And he did not answer that question like a priest or a wise man or a guy off the street. He answered it like a psychologist. Listen carefully to how he answered this question. He talks about how the psyche is mysterious and that it defies the laws of space, time, and determinism. And just see how, I want to thank you for watching this, and we're concluding with Carl Jung as answering that question.
I remember you said that death is psychologically just as important as birth. And like it, it's an integral part of life. But surely it can't be like birth if it's an end.
Yes, if it's an end. And there we are not quite certain about this end. Because, you know, there are these peculiar faculties of the psyche that it isn't entirely confined to space and time. You can have dreams or visions of the future. You can see round corners and such things. And ignorance deny these facts here. It's quite evident that they do exist, and have existed always. Now these facts show that the psyche, in part at least, is not dependent upon these confinements. And then what? When the psyche is not under that obligation to live in time and space alone, obviously it doesn't, then to that extent the psyche is not submitted to those laws. And that means a practical continuation of life, of a sort of psychical existence beyond time and space.